I welcome you all to this very interesting new RDX webinar from Biomedical. My name is Herman Groepenhoff. I'm part of Medical Affairs, and I'm happy to introduce to you Professor Brian Graham, who is very involved, of course, in this topic. He's the first author of the 2017 published ERS ATS standard for single breath diffusion, but he's also the second author of the GLI reference values for DLCO in Caucasian. So again, very happy to introduce Professor Brian Graham from Canada. And I'm as well very interested, and I like his title, Achieving and Assessing Top Quality Measurements and speaking about grading in these DLCO measurements. So Professor Graham, please take over and start your webinar.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to talk to folks about diffusing capacity. It's obviously a passion of mine. And although the title for the webinar was about alphabet soup, soup is just an appetizer. And what I will be talking about is the full meal. And although soup would usually come first as an appetizer, it's going to come about 3/4 of the way through the talk, because I'd like to talk about some of the reasons that we require this kind of grading in the system. So to begin with, here are some potential conflicts of interest. I get speaker fees. The one that some people might worry about is that I do have a patent for a new spirometer calibration syringe accessory and an agreement with Hans Rudolph. So that's the only thing that's going to make me any money there. And just a little bit. And as far as the objectives of this talk, I would like to review some of the frequently asked questions that I get about the 2017 guidelines and talk about some of the deficiencies that we had in the standards and what we can do about that. I want to really briefly talk about some of the quality control measures that were introduced, and that really gets into the assessment of how we know that we're doing good quality diffusing capacity. And then we'll talk about the grading system and how it's been modified. I'd like to also talk about some of the rationale for the adjustments we do to diffusing capacity. And finally, something that we've missed, but is still very important, are the responsibilities of the technologist and the patient concerns. So to begin with, one of the changes in accuracy that we introduced in the 2017 diffusing capacity standards was that we tightened the flow tolerance from 3% in the old standards to ±2% over the flow range of -10 to +10 liters per second. The syringe calibration, the calibration syringe still has a tolerance of 0.5%. So the combination of these gives a 2.5% tolerance. And so the calibration needs to be within 75 milliliters of that 3-liter syringe. Now, just to clarify, when the 2019 spirometry standards came out, we specified a 2.5% flow and volume accuracy. And a lot of folks were saying, well, does that mean we can still use that accuracy when we're measuring diffusing capacity? But the answer is no. It still is 2% for the diffusing capacity standards. And the reason for this is that we're dealing with a smaller flow range than spirometry. And the other thing is that the pulmonary function systems that are doing diffusing capacity tend to have better grade flow devices than some of the standalone simple spirometry systems in general. The other thing we introduced under calibration and quality control was the 3-syringe analyzer linearity test. And I get a lot of questions about this. So the test starts with about 1 liter of room air in the syringe. The exact amount isn't all that important. Then we conduct the single breath maneuver in the ATP mode, fill the syringe with test gas for the remainder of that 2-liter stroke, let it go through a breath hold and then empty it completely. And the measured diffusing capacity, and this is an absolute value sign, the measured diffusing capacity should be very close to 0, within 0.5 mils per minute per millimeter of mercury of 0. And the alveolar volume should be within about 10% of the 3-liter syringe. So there's a couple of questions that come out of this. Is that what is the principle behind this? How does this work? Well, in looking at the linearity of the gas analyzers, we're actually now introducing gas by diluting it by about a third, because we've got that 1 liter of room air and then we had 2 liters of test gas. We're working at a different part of the concentration curve. And if there's a nonlinearity, then the CO might be reading higher than it should be, if there's or it could be reading lower. If it's reading lower, the system would say, well, it appears that I'm reading less CO than I would have expected. That must mean that it's diffused out of the syringe, and you'd get a calculation of a diffusing capacity. And that would be a positive diffusing capacity. But if the nonlinearity goes in the other direction, that's where you would get a negative diffusing capacity, because it would be measuring a higher concentration of CO than it should. Of course, the linearity of the tracer gas analyzer, usually methane, is the one that will give us the accuracy for the alveolar volume correction. So that way we can test whether the gas analyzers are working properly. One of the deficiencies in the guidelines that we should have talked about was, first of all, having a longer breath hold time. It should be at least 20 seconds, because when you breathe in, even within that syringe, you don't get complete gas mixing, and that can cause some problems. It's nice to have it really well mixed within the syringe before you empty it. The other thing is the option of using a larger syringe. Some people use up to a 7-liter calibration syringe, because that way you can repeat this test at different starting volumes and test the linearity over a much wider range. Another question that we get is in regard to the biologic quality control. Now, in the guidelines, we suggested that someone who's fairly consistently measures their diffusing capacity, we should get consistent readings, and that's a way of checking that the system is working. But the really important thing here is that the biologic control is definitely not a substitute for the use of a calibration syringe. And but we still encourage all the technologists and operators to know their own diffusing capacity and alveolar volume, and that allows them to conduct a test on themselves if they suspect a problem. But one of the things we found is that in some jurisdictions, including a biologic control where you have to report the diffusing capacity of the technologist, may constitute a breach of privacy for the employee. And so this should be an option rather than a requirement. So let's look at the diffusing capacity maneuver. So here we have someone with doing tidal breathing. Now in our lab, before they inhale the test gas, we take them right up to total lung capacity and then breathe all the way down to residual volume. That's where the test gas comes in. And of course, this is the maneuver of that sharp inhalation, the 10 seconds breath holding, and an exhalation. Why do we do this maneuver? Well, there's a couple of good reasons. One is that before we inhale the test gas, we can have the patient breathe all the way in, and you've got a bit more time to do that coaching and get people to breathe in as much as possible. And once you've got people up here, you now have a target, so that when they do breathe in the test gas, you want to see them get back up to here. And in fact, breathing in and getting people to total lung capacity is one of the least well performed things in pulmonary function. That goes for spirometry as well. It's getting people to get that great big breath in and take them right up to total lung capacity. The other thing is that when you take people up to total lung capacity and then breathe out, we get a much better sense of what was going in, what the concentrations of tracer gas and diffusing capacity are before they take that breath of test gas. And that's important. And here's why. So when we, before doing the test gas, we get people to expire to RV. We're suggesting there should be a 12-second limit prior to test gassing, up to 12 seconds. You can either reach a plateau for people who are not obstructed, but for folks who are obstructed and they breathe out for a long time, we limit that to 12 seconds. And during that exhalation and right at the end of exhalation, we monitor how much tracer gas and carbon monoxide are left in the lung before they took the test gas. And we want to check, first of all, is the tracer gas washed out? And if it isn't, we can use that value to calculate VA. We can also use the expired CO concentration, first of all, to adjust for CO back pressure, but optionally, we can also use it to calculate or to estimate carboxyhemoglobin. And in some systems, that end tidal expiration can be used to determine whether there's any residual effects of water vapor or carbon dioxide on the analyzers. So before prior to test gas inspiration, some more clarifications here. So the end of expiration is either when the patient reaches a plateau, same as in spirometry, less than 25 mils in a second, or until an expiratory time of 12 seconds is attained. And then we measure the CO and the methane concentrations at the point where the expiratory flow falls to the level of the aspiration of the gas analyzer. So remember, those gas analyzers are constantly aspirating air out of the mouthpiece. And if the amount of air that's being aspirated out of the mouthpiece is less than the amount of air that the person is actually breathing out, then you're not getting a valid reading. So that indicates where the reading should take place. Now, in performing the diffusing capacity maneuver, the expiration times are limited to 12 seconds because if someone has obstruction and breathes out for a long time, that can lead to both hypoxia or a prolonged Valsalva-like maneuver, which may reduce pulmonary capillary blood volume, and that also reduces diffusing capacity. So our deficiency was that the maximum expiratory time wasn't specified, but we're suggesting now it should be 12 seconds. Similarly, on the final expiration after the breath hold, we want people to breathe out, but the end of that maneuver is either when, again, a plateau is attained. That's after you've done at the end, they've inhaled the test gas, they breath hold for the 10 seconds, and then they breathe out. And we say we breathe out until either a plateau is attained or once again the 12 seconds. And the other caveat here is when the expiratory flow falls to the level of the aspiration flow of the gas analyzer. So we'd have that same problem. We don't get valid data if we go any further. Now, we've also recommended to the manufacturers that they include an auditory beep to alert the operator when end expiration has been reached. And that is because as the technologist, you need to be watching the patient. You need to keep an eye on them to make sure that everything's going well. There's no sign of leaks, other such things. And you have to divert your attention back and forth between the computer screen and the technologist. And you don't want to be so focused on the computer screen trying to figure out what's happening that having that beep is a nice assist. So one of the things about our new, they're not new anymore, they're old, 2017 standards, is that we really made the move to the use of rapidly responding gas analyzers. And the previous ones were really heavily weighted towards the classical systems, where a physical sample of expired gas was collected during exhalation. And really the only data point you had was the tracer gas and the carbon monoxide in that sample right at the end. And the sample was more or less collected blind. You didn't have all of this other information. But now we have these wonderful rapidly responding gas analyzers, and they provide continuous data all the way through from the end of expiration prior to breathing in, and then the breath hold, and then breathing out. And so one of the things that we really stress in the 2017 is that we should be using all of this data because we've got all this data available. So first of all, looking at volume, one of the things you would see is was the expiration complete? Did the patient breathe all the way out? But the next thing is looking at the gas concentrations. And so was the CO down to 0? Was the tracer gas washed out completely? We have that data available. Let's use it. The criterion for the tracer gas being washed out is 2%. And we can see in this case, it wasn't washed out. And ordinarily, if we just use the old method of, for Jones and Mead method of calculating alveolar volume, this would give us an error of more than 2% in measuring VA. And of course, that directly impacts the error in measuring diffusing capacity. So what can we do about it? Well, if we know that this is the residual gas, tracer gas that's left in the lung before we start, because we've got all this data, we can do some better measurements. We can measure all of the tracer gas that went into the lung during inspiration. And in this case, the patient breathed in and then had a little puff out. This often happens when you relax against the mouthpiece. And so peak lung volume occurred here. And then during expiration, we monitor, again, all of the tracer gas that comes out during expiration. So if we know how much they had to, before they inspired the test gas, how much more came in with the test gas, and then how much came out, we can calculate how much was left after they finished breathing out. And so we have the tracer gas at end concentration, and we can use this as our mass balance equation for calculating absolute lung volume. And where we calculate absolute lung volume is really at the end, not at TLC. So this data says, what was the lung volume when they finished breathing out? And then we add in the, of course, the volume that we saw them breathe out, and that gets us back up to TLC, and that's where we calculate total lung capacity, and of course we subtract the dead space to get alveolar volume. And so if we expire completely, we get a better measurement. The other advantage here is that if you make, say, a 10% error at TLC in your calculation, you could be out by 500 mils. But if you are measuring down near the bottom, that same error would be about, if you're still off by 10%, that's only 200 mils. So this again will reduce the error and give you a much more robust measurement of lung volume. Because the old one, for example, if the sample was here, it's assuming that all of the tracer gas is uniformly mixed in the lung, and we can see it isn't. We can see that the if you're only going to use the tracer gas in one little sample, you would get continuously different measurements of lung volume depending where you took that sample. Another change that was made was adjusting where the sample occurs. Now, before the guidelines were introduced, we already had many manufacturers introducing the concept of showing you where the sample was taken, and it was usually on a graph of concentration versus time. And so in this case, we could say, well, the alveolar sample was taken at this point. And then it gives the technologist the option of shifting this if they think that some of the dead space gas has been included. So in this graph, the technologist looked at this and said, you know, there might have been some test gas in here. I'm going to move the sample along, and they moved it a little bit. So all you see is, again, the sample has moved. There it is. What we've recommended is that this graph should be given as concentration versus volume. And that tells us a lot more about what's happening, because now we can see the washout volume a lot more easily. We can draw a nice regression line through the slope of phase 3 and get the break point of where we switch from phase 2 to phase 3 in the washout and take the sample at that point. We also see that in this case, it's a half-liter sample. If we look to where this one got moved, we can see it was moved well down the curve, far more than it should have been. That actually this breakpoint calculation was just the right place to take it. And if we move the sample later into exhalation, we actually end up overestimating diffusing capacity. Here's a graph that we included in the standards, and this is really pretty much a carryover from the 2005. And although it gives you some qualitative indices of what can happen with a maneuver in terms of looking at lung volumes, there's no quantitative stuff in here. And so it wasn't nearly as helpful perhaps as it should have been. But what are some of the things that can happen? Well, as we saw in that previous graph, when someone breathes in, they might breathe in all the way up to TLC, and then as they relax against the mouthpiece, a little puff comes out, and then they go on to breath holding here. So there's I don't like the word overshoot, because you can't overshoot TLC. It's as big as you can get. But so how much of this is too much? Well, in respiratory medicine, we usually try to think of about 5% of FBC as being important, and that might be something you can use here. Actually, because diffusing capacity changes very little when you're really near TLC, this probably isn't going to have a very big impact. A bigger problem is a stepwise inhalation, where you breathe in, they didn't quite get all the way up to the top, take a little, slow down a bit, but then the technologist is saying, no, breathe in, and then they come up. That again is much more of a problem. And once again, if this is more than about 5% of FBC in here, that's probably not worth looking at. Another, what counts as a stepwise inhalation is that right near the end of breath hold, little puff comes in. How would that happen? Well, if someone were, while they were breath holding, were doing a Mueller maneuver, they were still trying to breathe in, but they couldn't because the valves were closed. And when the valve opens, a little puff comes in. So that's a concern, because if they're doing a Mueller maneuver during breath holding, they're actually drawing blood into their lung as well, and you'll overestimate diffusing capacity. The stepwise exhalation, again, is more of a problem because once again, we've got here, this is someone that's leaking out, breathing out actually before the end of the breath hold, before they really should have been starting. So that's a problem area. Inhalation too slow is another part of it. If you really drag out that inspiration, you can overestimate diffusing capacity. And this can be a problem for, obviously, for someone with a fixed upper airway resistance, and this might be the best they can do. And if that's the case, you've got to alert the interpreter to that message. If we see expiration being less than inspiration, we might worry that there was a possible leak around the mouthpiece or the nose clip. And this is something we're emphasizing a lot more in spirometry as well. If they breathe out and they breathe out a lot more than they breathed in, you worry that you didn't get them down to RV at the beginning. And that's also a concern. We also can have problems with gas concentrations, and that's the other curve that we put in the standards. So we'd like to see the gas concentrations come right up nice and sharply to the top, stay constant during breath holding, and then we'd have the washout and going to the expiratory concentrations. One of the things that we might see here is an inspiratory leak. So rather than going up straight, we get this noise that's happening here. This is often associated with problems with the demand valve, maybe a leaking demand valve. It can also be gas leaks around the mouthpiece or other areas. So seeing this is a problem. It means that there was probably some room air being aspirated in addition to the test gas. Another problem that's probably I've seen more frequently is gas concentrations falling during breath holding. One of the reasons that this can happen in some systems is that because you've got those gas analyzers, again, they're constantly aspirating gas out of the mouthpiece. If you close off the demand valve and you close off expiration in order to force breath holding, and those gas analyzers continue to draw air out, you create a vacuum, partial vacuum within that mouthpiece, and air can leak in. And if air leaks in, you get these concentrations dropping. If the concentration drops, but then returns up to this level before you breathe out, that's really not a problem because there's no real change in volume that's happening during this period. This change in concentration isn't going to impact any of the measurements. However, if we have something like in this case where there's been some room air aspirated into the mouthpiece and then they start blowing out, we don't get the concentration going right back up to here. That will affect our measurement of dead space. And so that is a problem and something that would need to be repeated. So here's an example of some of the things that I get. Somebody's emailed me a curve and said, you know, what happened here, or is this acceptable? And so we have in this graph, this is the mauve line, or the purple line is the patient breathing tidally, breathes all the way out, takes the breath in, the volume part of it looks quite reasonable. The red is the CO and the washout is pretty low, but we can already see that the tracer gas was washed out, wasn't within spec of the washout here. So there was a breath in and there's a little bump at the end. So the bump could have been that the patient breathed out a little bit, but it's a bit worrisome that you would get this much of a bump. And it appears that all the valves were shut off during breath holding. So we get this nice straight line here. But then before the beginning of expiration, we've already got a drop. And that's because as they opened the valve, a bunch of room air came in and everything went down. And so we see that dropped a terrific amount. And so once again, now, if we're looking at the exhaled tracer gas, we don't get that nice curve that allows us to get dead space, and similarly for CO. So this is the type of maneuver you would have to reject and retest. So that brings us into thinking about what is the acceptability of diffusing capacity maneuvers, and what are we most worried about? Well, the two really important things that we have to do is we want to get the person up to TLC. We want to make sure that we've got the biggest VA, because that's going to give us the best measurement of diffusing capacity. And how do we do that? Well, the way we've looked at this is that we say we want to make sure that that inspiration of test gas is at least 90% of the largest VC we've measured before. And that's probably the best proxy we can use to say if they breathed in that much, they probably did get up pretty close to TLC. And but we said that because some people don't get all the way down to RV before they start, if that gas is more than 85% of the largest VC, so if they inspired that much test gas, and this is an important thing, it is and, you have to have both, the alveolar volume is within 200 mils or 5% of the largest VA from another acceptable maneuver, we would say that that would make this maneuver acceptable. But for clarification, there must be at least one maneuver where the inspired volume is more than 90% of the largest VC in the same session before the second criteria can be applied. So if you have two that are at more than 85% and within 200 mils, that doesn't matter. You still have to have one that's got at least 90% of the largest VC. The other thing is stating the same test session has led to confusion, because what happens if after you've done the diffusing capacity, you do your post-bronchodilator spirometry and you get a bigger lung volume there. So the intent is that you gauge the VI against the largest VC you've observed either prior to or during the diffusing capacity trials. And so if you do the pre-bronchodilator spirometry, then give them the bronchodilator, and while the bronchodilator is taking effect, you do your diffusing capacity, then you do post-bronchodilator afterwards, and say you measure a bigger VC post-bronchodilator. You don't have to go back and reevaluate. You use the VI during the test session. On the other hand, in trial 1, if you get a VI greater than 90% VC, but on their second trial, they get a much bigger VC, then you have to go back and reevaluate this first one, because it might be that now the second one has given you a larger VC and the first one might have been out of range. In terms of repeatability, we wanted 2 acceptable diffusing capacity measurements, which are within 2 milliliters per minute per millimeter of mercury of each other. And I apologize now, it just occurred to me I should have had the SI units in here as well. So sorry about that, but they are in the paper. And what a study has found, about almost 5,000 test cases, that this kind of level of repeatability was achieved about 95% of the time. So this is a reasonable target, and this is something you should be shooting for. So now we get to the alphabet soup part and the quality control grading for diffusing capacity. If there was one thing, if there was only one thing I could change with the 2017 guidelines, it would be leaving this out. This was a problem. We were asked to come up with a grading system. The only grading system that was available was the one that was being used in Bob Crapo's lab, and this was the system that was used. And it has some problems. It was unclear, it wasn't validated, and it wasn't really the kind of thing we need for our rapid responding gas analyzers, because it did have also this sample collection time requirement in here, which was really related to the discrete sample collection maneuver. So if you have a paper copy of the 2017 diffusing capacity guidelines, I want you to put a big red X over table 3 and try and expunge it from the files. In the later on in the same year, in 2017, when we developed the recommendations for standardized pulmonary function report, we developed a revised grading system. And the really important parts in the grading system, again, are, did they breathe all the way in, where we look at what was the fraction of inspired test gas over the largest VC before, and was the breath hold time in spec. Within the grading system report, we also still had a sample collection time, but once again, that only applies to the old systems where you were collecting a sample blind, and the sample collection time was in there to make sure that you weren't taking too long to collect that sample. But now, of course, with the rapidly responding gas analyzers, we can see exactly where that sample was being taken and adjusted as necessary. So we don't need that third column. There's still problems here. And one of the big problems is that the grade that's assigned applies only to the individual maneuver rather than the test session as a whole. So we should be trying to get 2 grade A maneuvers. So a grade A maneuver is if we breathed in more than 90% of the largest VC we've seen previously, and we have a breath hold time in that 8 to 12 second range. This is really not much of a problem. We consistently see breath hold times being very close to that 10-second mark. Grade B is if we only get up to 85%, which was the old standard in the 2005, and of course we go C and D if you're only up to if you only get to 80%. So this really specifies the degree of confidence that the interpreter can have that this was actually a really good measurement of diffusing capacity. So this A gives you the most confidence that what you're measuring is correct for that patient, and as the grades fall, you have less confidence in that measurement. So what are some examples of how we apply the acceptability and repeatability in the grading system? So here's some examples. So let's look at the first set. And in the first set, we had 2 trials. In both cases, the inspired test gas was more than 90% of the largest VC. So both of them met the criteria. And when we looked at the diffusing capacity measurements, they were well within that 2 mils per minute per millimeter of mercury tolerance. And so this one qualifies. We've got 2 grade A maneuvers and they're within tolerance. We're fine. In the next set, we have in trial 1, 91% of inspired gas over the total lung capacity was breathed in, but in the second one, it was 88%. Well, now we can apply that second rule, because we can say that if the VAs were within 200 mils, and they are in this case, then this 88% qualifies as still meeting up our grade A criteria. So we get the other green here. Now we can go back and check, are the diffusing capacities within 200 mils? Yes, they are. So that's a good session. We're fine. So the third case here, once again, we start with this first maneuver being at 91% of the VIVC and the second maneuver at 88%. But in this case, when we look at the VAs, we see that they weren't in range, that the second one was lower than it should have been. And so we cannot upgrade this one to a grade A, and we have to do another maneuver. So here we get another case where both of these are less than 90%. They're close, one's 88, one's 87, but they haven't hit that 90%. And even though the VAs would be within spec, we can't consider that as being important. We still have to do another maneuver. And when we do another maneuver, we might find that the VAs are within spec for these two as well, and the diffusing capacities are in spec, and we might end up with 3 grade A maneuvers, but we can't say that until we've done at least one maneuver where we've been over 91%. And finally, if we have both maneuvers meeting the inspired gas criteria, but the diffusing capacities are not within that 200 mils, then once again, we have to do another maneuver. And so that's how we use this to really gauge our quality control. So another thing that we introduced in the new guidelines was adjusting for barometric pressure. And so why do we do that? Why are we concerned about adjusting for barometric pressure? And this graph shows average barometric pressure at some cities around the world. And it shows how it varies with altitude above sea level. Most of the large cities in the world are very close to sea level, and they'd be right down about here. Paris is only about 50 meters above sea level, or a little less than that, depending where you are and where the lab is. And so there's not much of an effect. But of course, as you go higher and higher above sea level, the barometric pressure drops. And as the barometric pressure drops, a couple of things happen to that test gas when it goes into the lung. One is that the percentage of the gas that is water vapor increases, because water vapor is dependent. The water vapor partial pressure is only dependent on the temperature. And as long as you're at body temperature, the water vapor partial pressure is fixed at 47 millimeters of mercury. And as you have lower and lower barometric pressure, that 47 becomes a larger and larger percentage of the gas. The second thing, of course, is just that as the pressure drops, the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveolus drops as well, and you get less gas being transferred across the membrane because there's less of a driving pressure to get that oxygen across. And when there's not as much oxygen going across, of course, as you get to higher altitudes, the hemoglobin saturation will drop. And so how does that affect the carbon monoxide? Well, now any carbon monoxide that goes across the blood gas barrier and into the red blood cell will have less competition for that hemoglobin, and will be binding much more tightly. And so as oxygen drops, the carbon monoxide will have a much better advantage in being taken up by the red blood cells, and that increases diffusing capacity. So of course, carbon monoxide has about 240 times the affinity for hemoglobin as oxygen. So that means if there's 240 oxygen molecules and 1 CO molecule fighting for the same spot on the hemoglobin, it's about a 50-50 chance which one wins. But of course, in terms of diffusing capacity and the classic thinking about it, we always were taught from the start, from Krog's initial equation, that when the CO goes across the membrane, it's taken up immediately by the hemoglobin and the back pressure is 0. But no, it isn't, because some of the CO does get knocked off by the oxygen and it's there. So that was perhaps a bit of a long-winded explanation, but what it points out is that as you decrease the barometric pressure, you end up increasing diffusing capacity, because it's easier for the carbon monoxide to get taken up into the blood. And so, and what we find, of course, is that as we increase in altitude, we get increasing errors and overestimation. It's not really an overestimation. We actually do measure a much higher diffusing capacity. So diffusing capacity increases as the altitude above sea level increases. And so even if we get to a place like Chicago, which is about 200, 250, we start getting about a 1% error. By the time we get out to 500 meters, and I got this in because where I am in Saskatoon, very close to the same level as Munich, we're already up to about a 3% increase in diffusing capacity. And if we get out to around 1,000, then that's places like Ankara in Turkey or Calgary here in Canada, we're getting closer to a 6%. Salt Lake City and Zurich are both at about 1,600 meters above sea level, and that's about 7% higher. And Salt Lake City, of course, is where Bob Crapo did his initial diffusing capacity standards at this level. Now, as you start getting to even higher levels, and in the US, Denver is called the Mile High City at 1,600 meters. We're up well over 8%. And but the winner here is Mexico City, and there we're very close to a 12% increase in diffusing capacity. So what do we do about that? Well, in developing the reference values for diffusing capacity with the GLI, the Global Lung Function Institute, we had standard sets of diffusing capacity that were collected from a lot of different locations around the world. And we found that if we adjusted all of them to sea level, that they came together much more with much more differences. And that really increased our confidence levels. So the diffusing capacity is adjusted, or at least the predicted values are adjusted to sea level. And we have the formula for how you would adjust it. Now, the thing is that in most labs, you still report the diffusing capacity that you actually measured, and you would adjust, and what people are usually prefer is that you adjust the predicted value to your current barometric pressure, so that that will give you a better estimate of the a better comparison, rather than reporting taking the measured diffusing capacity and adjusting it down to sea level. So this will be a different preference, whether you adjust your measured diffusing capacity or the predicted diffusing capacity, but it's the way that you would do that. Now, if barometric pressure is unknown, you can estimate the mean barometric pressure at the altitude of the lab using this formula. But you really should measure barometric pressure, and a pulmonary function lab really should have a good measurement of barometric pressure. And there's one more point I just want to go back to the previous slide to point out, and that is that you see this yellow line here around the middle. So even though barometric pressure increases with altitude, this yellow line shows the difference between a low pressure cell and a high pressure cell coming in. And so that even though, say, even at sea level, you don't get 760 all the time, it's going to vary depending on whether you've got a high pressure cell or a low pressure cell coming in. And that can make a 0.5% difference in extreme values. It can make even a 1% difference in the measurement of diffusing capacity. That sounds small, but there are so many sources of error that we can't control. Let's control and do our best to control the ones that we can control. And that's really an important principle in looking at diffusing capacity. So we should also be adjusting for hemoglobin, because as the amount of hemoglobin increases, diffusing capacity increases. And we've said that we should be using reference values because hemoglobin changes with age, sex, and ancestral origin. We should also be adjusting for carboxyhemoglobin. So if we measure carboxyhemoglobin, we know that if there's large amounts of carboxyhemoglobin, that will also reduce diffusing capacity. Now, finally, I'd like to just say a couple of things about the technologist and the importance there. And we did, in doing the 2019 spirometry standards, we addressed this in detail, and we didn't include it in the 2017 DCO standards, but I would suggest that this applies equally well, and that operator training and maintenance of competency must be integrated in any testing service, and operator qualifications and policy, it must be in the policies and procedures manual for your facility. Another really important thing is that your operator comments. They're a really important part of the test report. It really gives the interpreter the context of where, of what was happening with the patient at the time you were doing the testing. In the spirometry standards, we recommended a drop-down menu with specific comments. And a lot of those comments would still apply to the diffusing capacity. And I would encourage you to look at the online supplement for the spirometry standards, which gives examples of the types of comments that are most useful. The other part of it as well was we didn't really go into a great lot of detail about the conditions, the general considerations for testing and how you prepare the patient for the test. In the spirometry standards, we revised these. I would say those same things apply, except that in the spirometry standards, we said no smoking, vaping, use within an hour of the test. This should be for, if you're doing diffusing capacity, we don't want that to happen on the same day of the test, because we don't want the, we want to keep that CO back pressure as low as possible. And it's also important to report any new or observing systems that are there. In the spirometry standards, we also did a survey of patients to ask them about what are some of the things that they were concerned about in doing tests. And the survey really pointed out a lot of interesting things. And once again, I would refer you to this document. It should be in the list that of references that I hope were circulated to you, and that will give you some ideas of what are the kinds of things that the patients are concerned about. Because really the overriding thing here is that as a technologist, you need to have the right skill set. You need to know what you're doing in testing. You need to know how to make your instruments work the best, how to keep them calibrated. That's really important. But you also have to have the mindset. You have to have the respect, the empathy to really engage that patient. Because remember, we're doing this for the patient, and you need to do what you can to get the best results for that patient. So these are the references. I'll leave this up for now while we answer some questions. But I think that as I say, I hope that these have been circulated to you, and if not, they can be made available. So Herman, I guess we might have some questions here.
Yes, Professor Brian Graham, thank you for this excellent presentation, clear presentation, and thank you for your latest also conclusion. Although it's a very technical thing, you make it clear that at the end it's for the benefit of the patient, and I like this very much. Yes, we have already some questions, and I will encourage all the attendants to raise your questions by the questions and answer box. The first question, and we have still 10 minutes. Should the target for inspiration come from the actual vital capacity? So like in the same visit before the DLCO already measured, and I know you can also read the questions, or is it okay to use the first part of DLCO? So I guess if you start with DLCO, you start with the vital capacity first out, completely in, and you do the second, you can use the first as a reference.
So if you have a larger measurement of vital capacity that you've observed, if you've done spirometry ahead of time, that's the one you use. You use the largest you've seen, not the largest just in doing the testing, but if you brought that patient in and on that day, the patient's already demonstrated that they have a vital capacity either through spirometry or through other testing that is larger than what you've measured, that's the one that you use. Use the largest that you've seen, regardless of whether it's part of the diffusing capacity testing set or the spirometry that you've done or other testing that you've done just within the session on that same day on the same patient just before the blow.
Okay, so so as I understand you well, so you can use your first trial from your DLCO measurements.
Yes, I mean, if all you've done, if you just start cold with diffusing capacity,
Yeah.
then you don't have a whole lot to go by. You have to, provisionally accept it, so to speak, because you want to see that repeatability coming in. But again, if you're, it's really important to get that, to stress people, to really push them at both ends, to get them to breathe all the way out and then to breathe all the way up again. And that's really the important part of it.
Yeah. To be honest, it seems I spent 30 years on the PFT lab. So do you recommend do you recommend this sequence, or do you recommend first to do spirometry?
That's a good question. I think I'm just, my screen has just shifted here. There we go.
No
okay. All right. So I think there has been some work on that, and actually within the 2005 guidelines, there was a discussion of what should be the sequence of testing. And I think that in many labs, because they want to be efficient, you want to respect the patient's time, and you also want to keep your own costs down. The common thing is to do spirometry, pre-bronchodilator, give a bronchodilator, start the spirometry, and then do post-bronchodilator. And there have been some studies done, and I believe that Philip Burgos did some really good stuff in Spain looking at that, and found that there really was no effect of using salbutamol or albuterol on diffusing capacity in that set. So it's really the other part of it too, I guess, is how do you get the patient comfortable with the machine? I mean, my own feeling is that I would always like to start with a slow VC, because then you've got the time to take the patient to coach through it and to really get them used to sitting on the machine, making sure everything's linked up. But not everyone does a slow VC, and not everyone takes that time.
Okay, thank you. We are aligned. Is breath hold time, if the breath hold time of the maneuver is more than 12 seconds, should we edit the sample discard volume to bring it back down if possible?
No, I think that's I don't quite understand the rationale for how that might work. And I would say that we want to see that breath hold time. We don't want to see that prolonged breath hold time happening. And once again, prolonging the breath hold time will tend to overestimate diffusing capacity. So I think that's one of the reasons we try to keep that standardized, because we want to compare it. If you're going to be comparing to reference values, you're comparing it to people that have only breath held for 10 seconds. And I think we want to keep it down in that area. So I don't believe that that kind of an adjustment is really going to be all that helpful.
In addition to this question, what about sample volume, sample collection time? We see frequently, of course, an acceleration above 4 seconds, especially in COPD. Again, should we change the sample and discard volume to adjust for this?
Okay. So the sampling and discard time, as I mentioned before, was really because if you've got an old system where you are collecting more or less blind a discrete sample, and that's why that sample collection time was in the previous tables. If you've got rapidly responding gas analyzers, you can see exactly where you are and exactly where you should be taking that sample. So we don't need to worry about that. And I'm not as worried about the sample collection time in COPD. Yes, you're not going to get people who can really breathe out fast. So you've got to still try and get that, make sure that you've cleared the dead space. And I think that's really the most important thing. In COPD, frequently the very first puff that comes out, even people who have severe obstruction will get out a fairly quick puff right at the start, and then the sample comes on after that. So yes, you can have some problems with that, but I think that I would not be too worried about the sample collection time. And as far as the discard volume and the sample volume that were in place, again, in the 2005 guidelines, that was for the systems where you are collecting a physical sample. And so you let a leader go collect a liter, or, you know, those sorts of things. We're past that. We're using rapidly responding gas analyzers. We need to actually look and say, how much are we collecting? Where are we collecting it? And that's where we'll get the better measurements of diffusing capacity.
I agree. I cannot stop myself to do somewhere in between some questions for myself, and totally agree, of course. But what about repeatability? Of course, when you always do 750 discard, 750 sample, you do it always the same. Don't you see a threat? And again, like in CPAT anaerobic threshold, we can ideally find this, but with all the good PFT technicians thinking they know better and find another sample, I see a kind of threat. I see, you understand my question.
Yes, and yes, I've seen that as well. You know, you can see, well, you know, gosh, the diffusing capacity I measured here is outside that 200 mils. You know, if I just nudge this sample down, it's going to work. We're not going to get away from people cheating, if you will. You have to, again, you have to rely on the technologists to say that, yes, we're going to do this the best way we can, and this is what we'll do. Now, if you're an interpreter and you have access to the curves, you can look at that as well and say, you know, what happened here? Why did they move this along? It didn't need to be. And that would also throw up a bit of a red flag. So that certainly is something to look at. There are cases where it is completely justified, for sure. You can see that you've got either some of the dead space, or you collected it away, you know, too far down the curve, and you can adjust it. But I think the algorithms that I've seen lately that are being used to get that break point and get the sample at the right place are by and large pretty darn good. And usually the newer algorithms are getting the right answer.
Yeah. So you have to have a very good reason to change the sample, trusting the systems. You
Yes.
already mentioned several times the spirometry guidelines give some a recommendation how to do it. This can be applied to diffusion, but can we expect also DLCO new recommendations like spirometry recommendations?
It's a very long, involved process, and my strong preference is that these standards should be a living document. Mm-hmm. And we should be, as we put them through and get some experience with them, fix the little problems. And then you saw a lot of the things that I pointed out, things we could have done a lot better. I've also, for example, one of the things I've done is put up a collection of all the questions I've had and some of the changes that I recommended, and I've suggested to ERS and ATS that, you know, why don't we at least publish a little update to the guidelines, but it's not on, and so that's a little bit frustrating for me. But so it's far more of a process than it should be. The other thing that's also missing in this is a general kind of feedback forum, and I'm not really sure how we do that, but I've been getting a lot of feedback from manufacturers. I've been getting a lot of feedback from users, and some really good points coming up and things that we should have maybe done differently or should have considered but didn't. And that's a real problem with some of these guidelines. But and another important thing about guidelines are that the guidelines are the minimum standard. You have to do at least this well. Many times you can do better, and when you can do better, you should. And the guidelines should never hold back innovation. It should never hold back technology. It should never hold you back from doing a better job of measuring lung volumes and lung capacities and all the other pulmonary function things we do. And unfortunately, that has happened too often, is that people rely too strongly on just exactly hitting the guidelines and don't do things that would actually give you better results and improve. And so even, you know, like you know, spirometry and gas flow measurement, in many cases, we can hit 1%. You know, why aren't we doing that? And I think internally, in your lab, like in our lab, we don't even doing spirometry, we don't look at that 2.5%. We try and get down to 1.5% in doing calibrations. I mean, those are all important things.
Yeah, no, I think you already answered that. And one of my other questions is like, you see the 90% target, and then people say, oh, we reached it, but I think the target should be 100%. And this is exactly what you try to explain. But it's always confusing also for myself, adjusting the predicted values or adjusting the DLCO. And somewhere the question is about, and I also try to, when it is from the patient itself, like a physiological thing, like a hemoglobin thing, or when it's from the outside world, like what you explained in barometric pressure, then it should be the other one. Can you still, can you try to make this a little bit more clear? Because I also now in your presentation saw you even, it feels like you could do it both ways.
It's being done both ways. It certainly is being done both ways, and that depends very much on the labs and the interpreters and you know, what they're more comfortable with. And if you're always seeing people being tested in the same lab in the same city at the time, it's fine. But if you're testing somebody in Zurich and they come down to Amsterdam and get tested, you're going to see a difference. And you need to understand why there's a difference. And if you're comparing a pulmonary function report there to the one at those two different altitudes, which are very different, then you need to understand, and you need to make sure that you know which one is being adjusted, which one is being reported. In the standardized report, we said report the measured value and then report adjusted values so that you know where it was and what had happened. And in the online, the GLI online tool, which will give you it's labeled TLCO, of course, but you can do it in whichever units, either SI or traditional units. And there you have the option of showing what the adjustments are.
Yeah, so you leave space to do it. You know, the real world does it in two things, which is that is better than not doing it. And yeah.
Well, the thing is that you can one of the most difficult, I shouldn't say it that way. The people who have grown up with always doing it one way, and that's the interpreters, and they like to interpret it that way, they're going to keep doing it. and so you know, you might have equipment and other reports which follow one standard, but the people who are doing the interpretation in their own minds like to have it a particular way. I don't know that it's as long as they understand what's doing and the impact of how those reference values are being applied and the procedures, it's not going to be much different whether you do one or the other. So I really don't think we should be pontificating and saying you always have to do it this way.
Okay, we still have some short questions, and I will not try to put in my own questions. And sorry already for all attendance, but I think we can manage this in another 10 minutes, which I discussed also with Professor Graham, that he is okay. And I think it's always better to have a live answer than an email answer. Do you have any comments, resources about possible effects on ethnicity on DLCO?
Wow. Well, of course, this is currently a very topical issue, especially in spirometry. And you know, are there differences based on ancestry that will give you differences in lung volume? And if there are differences in lung volume, how does that translate to differences in diffusing capacity? So just having you know, looking at various differences in lung volume. If you expect people to have bigger lungs, you might expect them to have bigger diffusing capacity. But you have to remember, volume is only one part of it. The other side is the blood side. And so there can also be differences in hemoglobin. And certainly within the United States, the the NHANES study there showed quite large differences in hemoglobin between people of African ancestry and people of European ancestry. And so that's another concern. In the GLI values, when we got them, we did not have we had precious few studies in looking at population values of healthy people in diffusing capacity. We just did not have sufficient to really give us any notion of people who were other than European ancestry. So we don't have data on that. And that's an area where we do need to have more data and need to work on that. My own feeling is in this area, one of the reasons that we're seeing differences in lung volumes and predicted lung volumes is that we rely too heavily on height. We've always used height because it's easy to measure, but height is composed of three things. It's got leg length, it's got spine length, it's got head length. And if we're looking at how height affects lung volumes, we would expect the trunk length to be the most important thing. And so in people who have longer legs, and we use the same variable as height, of course, we're probably going to measure a smaller lung volume in people that have proportionally longer legs. So my own feeling is that where we really need to go is to find a different variable. And in a recent editorial in ERJ, I've recommended that very thing.
Okay. I think you already answered this question. Should we start by spirometry or diffusion of DLCO? And I think you said yes, but you can of course say.
Yeah.
Another one for reference. So I see also some spirometry related questions, but I think because you are also there, the author, you can answer them, and we try to help everybody. How important is to use GLI 2012 spirometry instead of the ECCS 1993?
So I think there's a few things to look at here, and in moving across the 2005 guidelines were quite a difference in both spirometry and diffusing capacity from the previous ones. And so the older European standards were developed with different equipment. And so the whole notion, both for using things like an expiration only spirometer and the old dry rolling seal spirometers, which were used at the time of collecting those older sets, the 1990, it was the 93 set, I think is what they were referring to. And so if you want to compare what you're doing now, you should be doing it as much as possible with similar equipment, or at least similar processes to what you're doing now.
What about the breath hold time of 6 seconds? Is this ever acceptable? So I can again speaking.
Yeah. So
people cannot keep their breath.
Yes, and so when that happens, if that's the best the patient can do, that's what you take and you report to the interpreter. This was the best they could do. There of course have been some studies in people who are doing nitrous oxide diffusing capacity, the NO. They only use a 5-second breath hold, and there are some comparisons of a 5 to a 10-second breath hold. In normals, it's not a huge difference, but I think that you don't want to give the patient so much grief. You certainly don't want to harm the patient. If they can't hold their breath for more than 6 seconds, you're not going to just block them off and not let them breathe. And so if that's all you've got, you accept that, you report to the interpreter that this was all they could do.
Another question is, of course, people should not use oxygen during the DLCO, so people can desaturate. What is an acceptable desaturation, lowest saturation value where you still can do a DLCO measurement? Thinking of this, you explained something about high altitude. I can imagine that the low saturation can also influence DLCO measurements.
Of course. And so again, this is a bit of a problem, and we've included some of those requirements in there, but it can take from breathing oxygen to breathing room air, it can take up to 10 minutes before you really equilibrate. And so we don't have that kind of time. So within the guidelines, we say, well, just get them off, have them do a few breaths and blow. Once again, we don't want to cause the patient any grief. And again, it's also really important to let the interpreter know what's happening. And so my own personal preference in this is that whenever we report diffusing capacity, we also report pulse oximetry. And so it's good to know both of those things, because they're two different but complementary pieces of information. And often when the physician will see the patient, a lot of them will just do pulse oximetry and see what the patient is in front of them. And now it might be a couple of weeks before they actually go to the pulmonary function lab. And when you do pulse oximetry there, whether or not they're on oxygen, that helps again put the test in context for the interpreter, because they might say, well, when I saw him in my office, he was at 95%, and now he's at the lab and he's only 92%. Something's happened there. And so, that's another part of it.
Okay, the last question, and then we manage within 15 minutes. What are your recommendations for a patient? And it's about what are the lowest discard and sample volume. And then, of course, people think of interstitial lung disease with very low lung volumes. What are the lowest settings? And I think now regarding this rapid analyzers.
Yes. Yeah, this really does strongly make the case for why you should be using rapid responding gas analyzers. And so in some cases, again, with low lung volumes, and depending on the type of system you've got, the washout can take up a big part of that. And you may end up with only collecting even just the last few hundred mils of the sample. But again, that's the best you can do. So that's the way you do it. But I think that's really important. We don't have a fixed discard volume. We don't have, in fact, we may not always have a fixed sample volume. And so all of those things are important for the interpreter to know when they're looking at the value, so they can say how much of this difference that I've seen, or how do I evaluate this test based on that. So yes, even when there's a small washout, when Jones and Mead did their studies, and they're the ones that everybody goes back to, they only collected 85 mils. That was their sample collection. So it was a really small collection. But of course, with normal people, with normal healthy people, that might be acceptable, but not with people with disease. Again, for this, you want to have a larger sample. It would be better in this. So I would say that in this sort of a situation, you find the point of dead space washout. If they've got really small volumes, you might end up taking everything you've got after dead space washout.
Okay, thank you. And by this, I want to close this session, and not before I of course, say a big thank you to Professor Graham for this excellent presentation, and also excellent answering all these questions. I apologize again for the extra 15 minutes, but for me it was already worthwhile. So I hope also for all of you, enjoy your evening. I'm speaking from Europe. Enjoy your evening or complete day, and hope to see you back in next webinars about this kind of quality topics, which are important. And this was also stressed by Professor Brian Graham. It is important to have the highest quality we can get for the patients. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. It was my pleasure.
Bye.